Welcome to the Triage Method podcast with me, Gary McGowan, and my co-host, Mr. Patrick Farrell. Paddy, how are you this week?
I am positively fantastic. Gary, the end is in sight. It is now, what is it, 2 weeks? 2 weeks away? 3 weeks maybe? No, 2 weeks away from the world, in Ireland at least, which is the world to me because that's where I live, before it opens up. So it's quite enjoyable. I can't wait to, see my friends, see my family, see the restaurants and stuff that I frequent, albeit we're only allowed in them outside, which is, whatever it is, but at least they don't have that, minimum spend and all that kind of shit that they had beforehand. And most importantly, it is the Irish Gympendence Day, so the gyms are back open, which is phenomenal from multiple perspectives, mainly because I enjoy going to the gym, but secondarily because our business also requires, well, not requires, as has been shown from the last year and a bit. But it's heavily dependent on having gyms open. So it hasn't been great having the gyms closed down, but they're open soon. So that is a fantastic, fantastic turn of events. Gary, how is life with you and how is your placement?
Life is good. I'm currently on neurosurgery placement and have got the chance to see lots of very cool brain surgeries, which is great for me at least. Not great for the patients, of course, but
well, no, it is great for the patients. I'd rather have.
Yeah. Great that they're getting appropriate surgical management, of course. But yeah, super interesting. Lots of time in the hospital, lots of cool procedures to be seen. So I can't complain.
Fantastic. Anyway, Gary, what are we talking about today?
Today we're talking about energy expenditure. As you'll know, if you've been listening for the last few episodes, we've been discussing the basics of calories, energy in versus energy out, calories in versus calories out, the components of metabolism, metabolic adaptation, and a number of related topics. And this is something that we've mentioned in previous weeks, but one of the things we want to explore this week in particular is what role does increasing energy expenditure play in successful fat loss or fat loss maintenance? And we'll also touch a little bit on those who are looking to gain muscle. But is it just as simple as, doing more exercise leads to burning more calories infinitely? Like, can I burn 30,000 calories a day if I move enough? Is that possible? That's one of the questions we want to explore. We also want to answer the question, is it the same if I burn 1,500 calories and eat 1,500 calories versus burning 3,000 calories and eating 3,000 calories? Because those two things are potentially achievable for someone at a given body weight. And, are they just the same if it's just energy in versus energy out? So they're the questions that we'd like to answer in this podcast.
Yeah, we'll kick it off by talking about what, and this is, I hate this term really. We'll talk about what's called G-flux. It's called that in the fitness sphere. In most other spheres,
it's generally energy flux in the
energy
research.
Flux. It's basically just energy in and energy out. Now, G-flux, I think it was popularized by John Berardi. I'm not sure why it's called G-flux. I think it stands for like gastric flux, which kind of makes sense. But at the same time, I'd rather conceptualize it. Maybe this is just because I like biochemistry and stuff. I would rather just conceptualize it as energy flux. So it is literally just energy in, energy out. That's what we're talking about here.
I thought maybe it was G because Gibbs free energy, but I don't know.
Yeah, that could be it as well.
Could be, but I actually don't know. I've never seen anyone say that.
Yeah, I haven't seen anyone talk about what the G stands for. But anyway, look, I just want to say, you might read stuff and it might say G flux, and you might read the other stuff and it might say energy flux, right? But basically, we're talking about this concept of energy in, energy out, right? So that's cool. We've already talked about that. We're not going to go over that stuff again. If you don't understand what that is, go back to the previous episodes of the podcast and listen, right? So most people, again, they're aware of energy in, energy out, and how that, equation dictates fat loss, because we're obviously talking about fat loss in this fat loss series, right? But obviously we'll touch on other things as well in terms of like muscle gain later on, because it is appropriate to discuss that. But there's this concept, and like you know this, if you've dieted yourself, if you talk to people who have dieted, there's this concept out there of, I want to eat as few calories as possible. I want to maximize fat loss, right? And this is purely from the perspective of only looking at that equation from a calories in point of view. Now, that's not totally true, because people often manipulate both sides, but they just talk about it from the perspective of like, I want to eat as few calories as possible, so I have this huge deficit, so I have to, liberate that energy from my body fat so I can burn more fat. So people end up in a situation where they eat very little. And what can often happen then on top of that is they exercise a lot, right? Or at least they try to exercise a lot. They do maybe extra cardio, they do some like resistance training. And that's good from a perspective of like, we're very much for people training. Like that's our bias. We like people training, right? So I'm not going to say that's bad necessarily. Now, obviously, look, there is shades within that. Like some of them are doing it bad in terms of it's like they're increasing their risk of injury, if I could speak, and other things. But look, that's a podcast for another time. I can't even speak today. A podcast for another time, right? But in this context, we're in a situation where that's one way of going about things. The way we go about things is we want to eat as much as possible while getting the results that we want, right? So in this context, if you're saying I want to lose a kilo per week, I have 5 kilos to lose, we're not going, okay, look, let's bang you into a 1,500 calorie deficit per week, which we know is going to lead to you binging on the weekend. And let's see if we can exercise loads more. Like, that's not what we're going to do. Our initial way we'll approach this is like, okay, let's get the exercise sorted, let's get your general habits sorted, and then let's use a mild deficit to slowly encourage that, right? But there is another thought process if you take our kind of logical, or what we would like to consider logical thought process of let's eat as much as possible while still getting results, right? That's our kind of thought process. If you take that to its logical conclusion, you might start thinking, well, if I want to eat as much as possible while still getting results, surely I can just exercise more, right? So I can just exercise more and then I can eat more and still be in a deficit, right? And like, again, logically, that makes sense. So you have people going up and they're doing like an hour of cardio in the morning, then they do 10,000 steps throughout the day, and then they also do like their resistance training at night, and maybe they also finish that off with some cardio, and they're doing that like 5, 6, sometimes even 7 days per week, right? Because they're like, I need to burn through a huge amount of calories in the day so that I can eat more, right? And again, logically, that's where you could potentially take this stuff if you're using our paradigm rather than the paradigm of like, I need to eat as little as possible, right? And so we have this kind of spectrum here where it's like, eat as little as possible or eat as much as possible while also exercising as much as possible, right? And there are issues with all of them. There's no perfect, like no intervention is without its faults, but just speak to that there, Gary, now in terms of, again, this is generally what is talked about when they talk about what John Berardi talked about when he talked about G-Flux. They talk about this concept of like, oh, we need to exercise more while also eating more, but still being in a deficit, right? Talk to me about that.
No problem. I think there's a number of really important things here. One is differentiating between maintenance itself, the process of weight loss, and then weight loss maintenance after weight loss, because they're actually 3 distinct states physiologically and psychologically. And anyone who has gone through any one of them will understand that. And when it comes to increasing energy expenditure up to higher levels, like let's say my maintenance, if I was sedentary, was 2,500 calories. If I start exercising more and get that up to 3,200 calories, it's a significant increase, but I wouldn't expect that to be detrimental in any way from the perspective of it's not that much activity that I'm not going to be able to recover from that or something. But as I get up to 5, 6, 7,000 calories of expenditure, like that starts to seem a little bit absurd.
And just on this, if you ever want to know what that looks like people do these type of challenges on YouTube where they're like, I'll see if I can burn 10,000 calories in a day, like they'll literally be like, the 10,000 calorie challenge of eating. They'll be like, let's do it in reverse and let's try to burn 10,000 calories. And you'll see how like absurd and hard it is to burn that many calories, but people do it. Absolutely.
And you'll kind of see these, I guess it's become a bit of a meme where people just say, oh, it's all just calorie deficit. Calorie deficit is all you need to lose weight. And it's like, yeah, that is true in one sense, but does that necessarily mean that me being in a low energy flux state at 1,500 calories versus a high energy flux state at 3,000 calories, that is exactly the same thing? And I would argue that it's not. And that's what many people would argue, because I suppose one of the things to note here is that and I put this at the start because it's often forgotten, is that there's a psychosocial aspect to this that is really important, particularly for those at lower body weights. So for example, if I'm, as I am, about 82 kilos, 82 kilo male, pretty active, my maintenance, jacked out of my mind, my maintenance at the moment, or the calories I'm actually eating at the moment to try and gain slowly, somewhere between 3,800 and 4,000 or so. Okay. That would allow me, if I wanted, to go out for breakfast, to go out for lunch, to go out for dinner, and even to have a glass of wine in the evening if I wanted. Okay. So I'm saying that even if I had the most extravagant lifestyle, I could actually fit that into my calorie targets because of how high they are. So that gives me so many options socially, that I'm not going to be dealing with any of the psychological side effects of having to isolate myself or say no to having dinner with my girlfriend or her family, or all these types of things that are the psychological side effects of dieting and the social side effects of dieting. Whereas if I was a, let's say, 50 kilo female who, works in an office job and goes to the gym in the evening, but it's 45 minutes of strength training, it doesn't burn that many calories, I might actually need to be eating like 1,400 calories or less to be losing fat at a considerable rate. Like, let's just say it's maintenance at 1,600 and we want to go into a deficit, and we get to 1,200 calories. Okay. Think about what it's like then for someone who wants to live a normal social life and consume 1,200 calories. Like, you need to have a very small breakfast and probably skip lunch to be able to have a dinner that anyone would consider substantial if they were eating out. The vast majority of meals that people have when they eat out are anywhere between 1,000 and 2,500, if not 3,000 calories. Okay. Especially as you begin to add up different courses, and you're absolutely not getting a glass of wine or anything on top of that. Okay. So that's very difficult psychologically and socially, because it means you now have to hold yourself back from partaking in normal social events that might be part of your life. So if that person was able to increase their energy flux towards, let's say, 2,200, now that actually might be manageable. Okay. So that's the first thing, is that there's those psychosocial aspects.
Just on that
Go
as
ahead.
well, right? Like, I do all the exploration calls or the consultation calls for people that want to work with us, and we work on a lot of that, like previous athletes, we'll call them, or people who used to be athletes. And this is something that is often just never talked about, but athletes fall into these really poor habits because they have such a high energy flux, right? So they're able to eat 4,000 or 5,000 calories. Like, I remember back when I was, working in a gym, also doing like 2 training sessions per day in terms of like, resistance training, and then also, doing like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu or MMA or whatever. And I would be maintaining my weight. I'd also cycle to and from my work, right? I'd be maintaining my weight on 5,000 calories, just maintaining it, right? So these athletes, they end up in this position where they don't build good habits, they don't build good nutrition habits, because they're able to get away with 5,000 calories, or like, oh, I ate 4,000 calories today. So anyone in the world would be like, that's fucking loads of food, and they'd be like, yeah, I was losing at like a kilo per week, I was losing weight that fast as a result. So I talk to so many people when we're doing the nutrition consults for them, and they're in the same position, and you see the effects of this. And it works both ways, in terms of, like Gary's saying, on a fat loss phase, where like you have a smaller individual that's, maybe more sedentary, and they're only burning through like 1,000 calories maybe per day, versus you have someone on the higher end where they're burning through 5,000 calories. There's a whole psychological, well, again, we can call it psychosocial, but there's a whole, like, we'll just call it practical element of this, where like you can get away with so much more on 5,000 calories versus that you can get away with on even 2,000 calories. And that's one of the big things that you need to really think about when you are engaging in a fat loss phase, especially if your life is a bit more variable, where it's like, okay, look, maybe you are in a position where you used to be able to eat 5,000 calories, or used to be able to eat 3,000 or whatever, but that's not your situation right now. Like, I know for myself, for example, like, I used to be far more active. Now I literally sit in my room. I literally work like 70, 80 hours per week, just sitting away at a computer, and I'm like, oh, like, even though I do like resistance training and I go for walks, like, I'm still not burning through all that extra energy. Like, I have a car, it's like there's stuff that you did when you were younger, like when you were a teenager, like you walked everywhere, like you don't do that anymore, right? And that leads to a situation where people think of it like this middle-age spread, or like, oh, I gained weight in my 20s or my 30s, and it's like, yeah, because you're not as active anyway. Like, that's a bit of a side tangent.
Yeah, and where was I? What I was saying? Yeah, so calories increase, psychosocial. Yeah, so then there's obviously the physiological aspects to that. So I suppose one thing to note is that fat loss aside, obviously getting more exercise to bump up your energy expenditure is almost always a good thing, up to a certain point, of course. But if you're able to, get up to, let's say, an extra 1,000 calories a day of energy expenditure from exercise, like that's some pretty decent energy expenditure. Obviously a lot less would be equivalent if you were at a smaller body weight, but if you're exercising once per day, or even twice per day, you're getting 60 to 90 minutes of exercise in per day, and you're walking throughout the day, like that's very much healthful practice. Where things become a little bit messier are at very high levels of energy expenditure, where you begin to see more and more compensations for the increases in exercise energy expenditure. So if you there's actually been some studies done on this, and it's something that will kind of evolve throughout this conversation on the idea of constrained versus fixed or linear energy expenditure. So the idea here is that if you have a just an additive model of energy expenditure, what that would imply is what most people think of when they think of energy expenditure, which would be, if I exercise more, I'm going to keep burning more calories. Okay, and this idea manifests in the way that kind of people romanticize hunter-gatherer populations, assuming that like they have much higher energy expenditures, and the reason that obesity is rampant in developed countries is purely secondary to sedentary lifestyles. Whereas what you tend to see is that energy expenditure between populations doesn't actually vary that much, even with differences in physical activity. Okay, which is interesting to consider, because like intuitively you'd assume that hunter-gatherer populations probably burn a lot more calories, but that's also because people kind of assume that they're just running 20 hours a day. It's just like a meme. But um, there's a number of compensations that occur as activity begins to increase. So as you begin to exercise more, let's say I'm running 2-3 hours per day, I'll start to feel a little bit more fatigued after those runs. Okay, I might.
Just before you go into that, right? You remember back from the previous podcasts, we have that like basal metabolic rate. So we
Yeah.
have that kind of like, this is your physiological functions. We'll call it your resting metabolic rate. So these are all the calories you burn just doing nothing, right? So most people would think of that as being completely fixed, but it's not quite right now. Go on,
Mhm.
Gary. Sorry for interrupting you.
Yeah, so rather than giving you my made up example, I'll give you a real example from some research that was done. This is obviously a very extreme example, but there's a basically a transcontinental race in the USA where you run 42K, I think it is, for 6 out of 7 days for 20 weeks. Okay. And on week one of the 20 weeks, what they did was they assessed energy expenditure in those individuals, in some of the runners. And keep in mind now the mileage is relatively similar throughout that period of time. And their initial energy expenditure was something like 6,800 calories per day. Okay. Super high. Okay. But as that went on, what ended up happening was their energy expenditure gradually began to decline. And at the end, it was about 4,800 calories or 4,900 calories. So it's a very significant drop in energy expenditure, given that they're still continuing to run those marathons. Now, of course, there's generally body weight loss associated with those um, long endurance races, but it doesn't account for the full difference, not at all. Okay, and there might be changes in running energy efficiency, and changes in activity beyond the run, etc. But overall, what we're seeing is that there's going to be a decline in energy expenditure from non-exercise activities. And this is very obvious when you consider some of the side effects people talk about when it comes to overtraining. So, for example, people will report a loss of their menstrual cycle. So you've got a decline in ovarian function, decrease in estrogen production, decreased fertility. If you think about those things, like why would they happen? You think evolutionarily, if you're, expending a lot of energy, that's generally associated with the food scarcity. Okay, so what you need to do is you need to be able to pull back energy resources from somewhere else, which at that point would be reproductive function, while you pursue your food. And then when we're in a state again of being a higher energy status, we're able to divert our resources towards that reproductive function again. So overall there, what you're seeing is that as energy expenditure increases up to a certain point, it will be linear. And that's generally at low to moderate physical activity levels. Most of us are probably in that level of like moderate energy expenditure. The specific level is going to vary between individuals. But as you really begin to push things up, you're going to get more compensation, where there's going to be a decline in some of those resting metabolic rate functions, but also things that aren't necessarily measurable. And what I mean, well, they're not measurable in the way that we generally measure muscular activity, because what tends to happen in these studies, and it's been kind of referred to as in some of the research on the constrained energy model as exercise energy expenditure 1 versus 2. 1 being the stuff that we can measure with an accelerometer. So, for example, like if I'm walking, an accelerometer that I'm wearing, like a Fitbit or something, that can detect those steps. But what it's not going to detect is changes in my posture as I'm sitting, for example, changes in resting muscle tone, changes in maybe how much I'm fidgeting and stuff like that. So all those types of things actually begin to, or seem to, downregulate considerably as a compensation for that increase in activity. So the overall message there, guys, is that we can absolutely begin to increase energy expenditure, and we can absolutely, try to keep pushing that up. But there will come a point where it begins to become constrained. And the problem with that is not just the fact that we're no longer burning extra calories, but also because, like, if you're doing that purely for the purposes of energy expenditure, then you run into some of the other issues, such as maybe poor reproductive health, lower energy levels in life outside your training, etc. So they're all things that you would want to consider. So increasing energy expenditure indefinitely is not something you can do. And the other thing there as well is that at very extreme levels of energy expenditure, there are also some limits as to what can be sustained indefinitely. And it's generally around 2.5 times basal metabolic rate is basically the peak level that could be sustained indefinitely. So even if you had someone that was fit enough to expend more energy than that consistently over time, that seems to be the limit. And that's based on a paper that came out last year, the year before, and it was in a lot of popular magazines and science publications about the alimentary limits to human performance. Alimentary, basically.
We'll come back to that, because there's some other numbers that I want to touch on.
Yeah, fair. Go on. Yeah.
Right. But the main thing you should take away from the constrained energy model thought process is that exercise up to a point is linearly additive, right? So it is up to a point in terms of your basal metabolic rate stays the same. If you add in more exercise, you'll just basically be adding in more energy expenditure, and you will still lose weight. Because this is really important to understand. There is linear addition up to a point, and then it seems to kind of level off, right? And like, you can look up graphs on this online. It's pretty intuitive once you see the graph. But what people don't realize is that basal metabolic rate, the stuff that makes up that basal metabolic, I can't even speak, metabolic rate, that can be influenced. And we've talked about this before in terms of, you start getting other stuff like down regulations in NEAT. So you try to out exercise your diet, basically, right? You're like, oh, I'll just do more exercise. What often happens then in those cases, like we've talked about previously, is you do your resistance training session, you do your cardio session, but oftentimes, your NEAT will go down. So you'll do less steps, or maybe you're tracking your steps because you're like, look, I want to get on top of this. I want to stay on top of, the non-energy, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. I want to stay on top of it. I want to make sure I'm tracking everything. Like, you can't track a lot of stuff. Like Gary said, posture earlier on. Like, you can't track how many times you're blinking. You can't track all those different things. You can't track like how fast your brain is working. It's like, you can't track all that stuff, all the stuff that makes up like the metabolic processes that go on, right? And you have to factor in that a lot of these metabolic processes are reactionary to the environment. Like reproduction is the easiest one to understand, because it's so influenced by what you're actually doing in terms of the energy in, the energy out. And if you ever look up any of the, like, it's traditionally called red S, females losing their menstrual cycle, in terms of like, there's a lot of like athletes and stuff lose it because they're just exercising so much and they're not eating enough, right? But one of the things to dealing with that is, and it's unfortunate, we have to take into account this constrained energy model, because there is a point where, yeah, you can add more calories. However, that doesn't necessarily fix the issue. If you have an individual who's training 20, 30, 40 hours per week, like you might be able to add enough calories so that they're in like weight maintenance, but you're not able to get that constrained energy model into a place where you want it to. Like, you're basically not shifting that graph back to where it's still linearly additive in terms of the calorie expenditure, like the exercise, so you're still always dipping into that basal metabolic rate or those basal metabolic processes. One of the most influenceable being hormones, in terms of like sex steroids, hormones, like, so those ones, you basically have to, if you are dealing with like red S, you have to take it from two prongs. You have to be like, right, we have to increase calories here because we need to have more free available energy, but we probably need to reduce energy expenditure as well, because we've dipped into this territory of this constrained energy model and we've started eating into this like basal metabolic rate. And this is really important to understand, because oftentimes people look at this model and they still go in with the paradigm that, oh, I can just eat more. I can just solve this whole thing by eating more, like assuming you want weight maintenance. And again, this is why we started with that kind of G-flux theory, where people were like, oh, I'll just exercise more and I'll also eat more. It's like, yeah, that's a good strategy up to a point, but then we get to a point where you could eat more and you might even gain weight, but we're still eating into that kind of basal metabolic BMR. So it's like you have to take the totality of the human into account, and there are some numbers thrown out there in terms of how much you can, where's the definable point where you start eating into that. And that's why I said, like, we'll come back to numbers in a second, which we will in a second as well. But I want to also touch on some things which make it hard, and Gary touched on one of them earlier on, make it really hard to understand the exact relationship, because I know people listening to this podcast, they want to know, okay, where's the exact point, right? And we'll give you some numbers in a second. But then they also want to go, oh, well, it obviously depends on what exact activity you're doing. Like if you're doing cardio, if you're doing, resistance training, if you're doing sports, if you're doing whatever, right? And this is one of the things that it is touched on a little bit in the research, but it's also so wishy-washy, hard to define. And that is like an increase in exercise efficiency, right? Because what often happens, like Gary said, with that race, like people get more efficient as they are doing the activity, right? So you naturally, if you're more efficient at doing something, you're not going to be like, spazzing out. You're not going to be losing all this excess energy to the environment, because all your movements are really efficient. You're like a machine, running or doing your sports or doing your resistance training or whatever it is. And as a result, you don't get all of this, loss of energy overall. And that is something to take into account, because it kind of encourages bad training processes, where if you really wanted to lose as much weight as possible and you really wanted to expend as much energy as possible, you would just do different things all the time, because you're just like, oh, I'm really inefficient at these things, so I'm just wasting a load of energy. And anyone who knows anything about training would know that that's not an effective way to train. That's not an effective way to get the neural adaptations, the muscular adaptations, and the other adaptations that we want. So we have to get out of the paradigm of thinking like, oh, well, I just want to burn through more calories, or, oh, I just want to eat more, and that means I have to burn more. And it's like, you have to look at a way bigger picture than just the energy side of all of this stuff. Does that make sense, Gary?
Absolutely, sir.
Fantastic, right? And then also, one of the things that I often think gets lost in this discussion is the recovery aspect of this, right? Because obviously, look, not everyone's going to be able to recover from 20 hours, 40 hours of exercise per week. Like it's just not going to happen for a lot of people. They just don't have that recovery capacity. Either that's a genetic thing, either that's just a training history thing. It's like, yeah, you'd be able to get up to that level in like 2, 3, 4, 5 years of training, but most people are just not at that point. So again, there comes a point from a recovery standpoint where you're not going to be able to do more training. So you really need to get out of this mindset of like, oh, I can just burn through more calories and I can kind of compensate with food then outside of that, because you hit a recovery wall. And this also is one of those things where we're basically eating into that BMR. We're eating into the capacity for your body to actually sustain itself and then also build in the future. And what often happens a lot of the time is, people will basically try to over exercise, and they just won't be getting any adaptations from that exercise, right? They're basically in that kind of like, stress adaptation curve. They're just always in that stress phase. They're never getting like adaptations to that, so it's like, oh yeah, I'm exactly as strong as I was 20 weeks ago, despite doing these exercises, despite doing these resistance training exercises, despite doing everything quote unquote right. And it's because, like, you're doing too much, and that's why you're not progressing. And that's something that you really need to understand, especially if you're a newer trainee, where you can kind of think like, oh, I should just do more, I should just do more, because that'll like shorten the process in terms of getting the strength numbers that you want or the results that you want. And that's just not the case. Like, yeah, it works for the first like 4 weeks, but realistically, anything works for the first 4 weeks. But then after that, it's like, no, this is not an effective, training process. And this is not an effective like way to design your overall program. And then the final thing I just wanted to say is, well, there's two other things. The first thing is that most people make out that this number is, really achievable for every average everyday person. And they make it out as if like exercise is just not effective. It's like, oh, exercise is not linearly additive in terms of calorie expenditure, and therefore we should just not exercise. Which, like, in my mind, I'm like, that's, well, first of all, it's ignorant. It's just ignorant of the actual science. It's ignorant of what we're actually talking about here. And quite frankly, it is dangerous. It's like that. If you're basically making out that exercise is just not valuable, like that goes completely against, we'll call it like a haze type approach, where you're talking about health at every size. Like, we want to just engage in healthful behaviors. And if you're telling people that exercise is just not effective at all, it's like, you just don't need to exercise. It's not effective from a fat loss perspective. It's not effective from like cardio perspective. It's not effective from whatever. It's like, that's just ignorant and dangerous. We want everyone exercising as much as is possible for them, given their life circumstances, etc. And that brings me to the final point, which is, look, you can talk all day about exercise being linearly additive, or however fucking whatever way you want to go for it, not being or being a constrained energy model, whatever. Most people have jobs, right? So you're not going to be able to exercise 20 hours per week, So you basically want to get to a stage where you do enough exercise so that, you can actually burn through a significant amount of calories day to day, where you're not dipping into this over expenditure where you're not getting return on investment that you want. But also, you don't want to be in the low example like I gave earlier on. Like, you don't want to be an individual that basically you're sedentary for most of the day, and like, you go to the gym and you burn maybe 200 calories. Like, it's very hard from we'll call it again a psychosocial aspect type of thing, but it's also very hard from just wanting to eat normal human food rather than leaves and chicken. It's like, it's just hard if you're going to burn through very little energy. So we basically don't want to go on either side of that spectrum, and we want to burn through a good amount of energy throughout the day. And then also, we want to eat to support that. Does that all make sense, Gary?
Absolutely. And may I continue?
You can continue, of course.
So, like, I think the key message, really, like, just to hammer home before we discuss further, is that exercising more is almost always a good idea within reason. And there is evidence supporting its role, like increasing energy flux in weight loss maintenance in particular. Okay, so that's one of the areas where the evidence, I think, is quite strong, that you would want to be exercising quite a bit for successful weight loss maintenance. And very often it's not weight loss that's actually the barrier, it's weight loss maintenance that's really challenging for people. So regardless of whether or not exercise contributes significantly to weight loss itself, weight loss maintenance, it absolutely does. Okay, and there's quite a bit of evidence to support that. And I mean, it does make sense as well, because, like, as discussed previously, when you do diet down and you lose weight, generally you're going to be in a suppressed metabolic state. Okay, but there's been those metabolic adaptations that have taken place on the way down. You've got decreases in leptin, increases in ghrelin. Basically everything that's contributing to increased appetite and reduced energy expenditure is working against you maintaining that weight loss. So if you can increase exercise, that has a number of really positive effects in mitigating those adaptations. So it would be very wise to keep your exercise up if you're trying to improve weight loss maintenance. And further to that, is that limit, I guess you could say. And I do think it's interesting to kind of ponder this, because like basically what you see, and this is a very strong relationship, is that there's an inverse relationship between the amount of energy you can expend and the duration of the activity. And that obviously makes sense. It's the very same as how fast we can go and how long the activity is. So effectively, if someone is doing an ultra marathon within a given day, okay, they can increase their energy expenditure massively, 6, 8, 9, maybe even 10 times basal metabolic rate. Okay, so it can be huge, but though that isn't going to be sustained indefinitely. And the way you can understand this is that there's a difference between the energy we provide through feeding and the energy that's available within the system that we've already stored. So we've got body fat, we've got muscle glycogen stored, so they're always available. But it seems like over time, we come down from that really high level of energy expenditure that we can achieve down to around 2.5 times basal metabolic rate. So let's say if my BMR is 2,000 calories, let's say, I'd be up around 5,000 calories as what I could sustain indefinitely. And it seems like the limit to that is actually more so to do with our capacity to digest and assimilate, that it's actually, we can't process that much food on a consistent basis indefinitely. Whereas if I was to do that in a short-term basis, I could just get it from my energy stores along the way. But obviously, if you're doing 100 or 200 or 300-day race, you can't do that because you'd lose all your weight, obviously. So that seems to be around that limit. And I think that's really interesting to consider, because it's like, all right, I can't just keep going and get up to 6, 7, 8,000 calories of energy expenditure and sustain that forever. It just doesn't seem like that's feasible. What was I going to say there? I can't remember what I was going to say. Oh yes, that I was thinking about this as well as I was reading on this topic. Like, it does seem like there's some examples in the research where levels above that have been sustained for quite long periods of time. That would be discordant with this relationship. Like, if you look at the research on this topic, the graph in terms of going from activities that last 1 day to 90 days and beyond is like remarkably consistent. But there are some exceptions in like Tour de France cyclists, and it has been, hypothesized that that could potentially because they're actually using, for example, intravenous glucose as a source of refueling, which is kind of fascinating when you think about it. Like, from, if you're interested in high performance, that, well, if the gut is potentially the limiting factor to human endurance, why don't we just get all athletes on like intravenous nutrition sources at every stop on a race or something? So I imagine that could be an avenue for future developments in sports performance, but not relevant to your weight loss efforts anyway. So do you want to jump in there?
Just on that as well, like, and I'm going to come back to this in a second, but you cannot discount the effect of drugs on all this stuff as well.
Oh yeah,
all
for
of
sure.
those Tour de France athletes are on drugs. So you might be going, oh, well, I'm definitely the outlier. Unless you're on the same drugs and unless you're doing the same training, it's probably not the same in
Absolutely.
you. So like, there are some drugs that affect all of this stuff, and I'm going to just touch on them in a second. But do you have anything else to say there, Gary?
That, like, just reiterating your point just briefly, like, yeah, obviously the drug point is really important, because like that is a very strong reason you could see the discordance there, because even like just going back to what I said, all those adaptations that could potentially be compensating for increases in energy expenditure through exercise, like for example, decreases in reproductive function. How does that manifest in a male? Decreased testosterone. What's a Tour de France cyclist likely to be taking? Testosterone. So, there's other factors at play.
Yeah, 100%. And this is where, like I said, like we can come up with some numbers for an average person. And I really like that you said, and it does seem to be the case in the literature, that it is more of a digestion and assimilation thing that becomes the limiting factor, right? Because as we were talking about earlier on, it's like this stuff is important from a weight loss perspective, right? But it is actually probably more important from a weight gain perspective, in terms of, like, say you are an individual trying to gain muscle, right? And you're like, oh, I'm going to go to the gym 6 days per week. I like a bit of cardio as well. I have a relatively high energy expenditure with work, blah, blah, blah. Like, there is a point with energy intake where yeah, you can be eating more food, but your body actually can't digest that food enough, or at a high enough rate to actually digest it, then assimilate it, and then turn it into the energy that you want, right? And this is obviously from the perspective of, you know, trying to gain weight, but it is also the case if we're using the same model where we're saying, oh well, let's, you know, exercise more and still be in a deficit. It's like, yeah, well, you can only get up to a certain amount of food in your gut, only a certain amount of food that you're able to digest and actually see that transform into energy, right? And conversely to that, in the opposite way, like there is only a certain amount of energy per day, at whatever time limit you want, per hour, whatever, that your body can liberate energy from stores, you know. And like, say you have like fat stores, it's like the metabolic machinery that's required to, you know, break those fat, that stored fat down, get it into the bloodstream, get it into, maybe it needs to be in the form of carbohydrates at the moment for whatever activity that you're doing, maybe it's higher intensity, whatever. Like there might be need to be some transformation that needs to go on there. Like the machinery that's doing that, it's just enzymes, right? You can get to a point where it's technically untrue, but you can get to a point where all of those enzymes are used, right? So you can still require more energy, but all those enzymes are at their max capacity, right? Now, obviously, look, the human body, most biological organisms are adaptive, so you would just start upregulating certain enzymes and whatever else. But there are limits to this stuff. Like you just can't keep going and getting like higher and higher levels of certain enzymes. It's like it just doesn't happen, right? So that is something to really pay attention to, because it is that digestive component. And like Gary said, like you could technically argue that, oh, well, maybe we'll just get them onto like intravenous nutrition, or, you know, somehow bypass, like, because they do this in hospitals. If someone has like, I don't know, a gut issue or like whatever, there's a reason for it. They're like, okay, well, we'll just get them on like a drip basically of food, right? And that can get around all these issues. But then it becomes an issue of like, would that be classified as doping in the sport? And like for most of it would be, because that is something that most athletes wouldn't have access to in developing countries. And that's one of the main reasons they supposedly ban drugs, because it's supposed to be fair of like, you know, your man in fucking Cameroon versus your man in like the United States. It's like they're supposed to have an equal footing in terms of their availability of like, you know, supplements and whatever else, which obviously isn't the case. But that's one of the reasons they want to keep sport fair, right? So that's why they ban those drugs, supposedly. Anyway, that's what they say. But you can get drugs all over the world. That's all I'm saying. They're easily ordered online. But anyway, look, that's beside the point. This is really important to understand, because there are probably numbers right now that we can just give out in terms of like, where is this limit for people? Where do we start seeing that dip into this, again, this constrained energy model, where it starts eating into some sort of basal metabolic rate? Like we start seeing some impact on, maybe it's I don't know, bone accrual, maybe it's hormonal function, maybe it's whatever. And based on the numbers that I've seen, this number, it's actually a little bit lower than at 2.5, right? Because again, like who's doing like the 2.5? Yeah, like who's doing the 2.5? Look, it's athletes, right? So there's probably some influence on drugs there, right? And also, like, most people are not the genetic elite, right? They're not getting to this peak. So for most people, it's kind of at that range of 1.8 to 2.2 times basal metabolic rate, right? So that's the amount of energy that you can turn into food, right? So that's the way you need to think of it. So if you get up to like 1.8 to 2.2 times your basal metabolic rate, that's kind of you tapped out with your ability to eat that food and then see that food transform into like actual energy in your body, like we've talked about before, get it into the actual ATP in your body, right? Because ATP is the currency of the cell. So that is something that you really need to be aware of. And again, as I said, that's probably more important for people when they're trying to gain weight, right? Because if you're trying to push up calories and you're like, oh, I'll just get up to like 2.5 times my BM more. It's like, yeah, like you can do that, but it's probably not effective, right? Unless you're on drugs. And you'll probably see this reflected in some easy to understand markers in terms of like your insulin sensitivity. Like you can get that stuff, you know, tested, but it's probably an easier one to measure is just like your fasting blood glucose, right? And like this, it doesn't even give you the full picture because the food is not even getting into your blood, right? So it's like this, it gives you a window, right, in terms of your ability to handle these nutrients, but it's not telling you everything, right? And there's a few components to this. We could also get like, you know, blood lipids. You could measure them, right? And the reason we can measure those, like blood glucose and blood lipids, is because basically if you have a situation where there's just food always in your, you know, we'll call it your vascular system, it's just always in your blood, right? Like that's not where food is supposed to be. That's not where the lipids, the triglycerides, whatever, are supposed to be. That's not where glucose is supposed to be. It's supposed to be in the cells where we want it, right? Now that's not the entirety of the story. But if we're talking about it from the perspective of like, oh, we want to build muscle, or we want to, whatever it is, right? We want to have that actually in the cells, not just in the blood, right? So that's something to be aware of, right? So basically, digestion can't keep up with the demands, right? Assimilation can't keep up, right? And then energy metabolism can't keep up, right? So there's those three components. You either see like digestion, you can't actually physically digest the nutrients, because remember, that is an enzymatic process. Like you need to secrete digestive enzymes, etc., into the intestines. You need to assimilate it. But let's assume that digestion gets to its point. There's also an actual like assimilation part of the story, where it's like actually getting into the body. And then the final part is like, we actually need to use this in like energy metabolism. So how is the mitochondria functioning? How is like all of that stuff going on, right? So there are breaking points with all of this stuff. And again, that seems to be around that range of 1.8 to 2.2, can't even speak, BMR, somewhere in there, right? Do you have anything to say on that, Gary?
Yeah, just to briefly mention as well, because I was talking about the kind of elementary limits, like to energy expenditure, it is worth noting as or putting that in context as well, because like obviously there's difference between individuals in terms of their gut function, of course. But another thing to really consider here is that if we're dealing with someone who's getting, let's say, upwards of if they're getting around that 2.5 times BMR limit, let's say, that probably means they're an endurance athlete. So let's say they're doing, let's say it's you, Paddy, right? Let's just call you 100 kilos for now, 6'5", BMR 2200 to 2500, something like that. Let's call it 2500. 2.5 for you, like that's what's that, 250 or something, 6,250 calories a day. And if you're getting up to that level of expenditure, that probably means you're, I don't know, running 4 hours a day or something. Let's say you're doing a 4-hour run per day. Like that's a good bit of activity. And you're also after that, you're still going to be feeling, super tired or whatever. So let's say you're doing 4 hours of exercise per day, and because you're a serious athlete, you're trying to get 10 hours of sleep per night because you're trying to recover from that. Because this is the context we're in. We're talking about endurance athletes. So we got 4 plus 10. Now we've got 10 hours of an eating window. So you're asking your body to consume those calories in that 10-hour period, while also appreciating that gut dysfunction or discomfort can be a limiting factor during exercise. Okay, so if someone's doing a 4-hour run, generally they're not going to be eating a big meal right before that. Okay, because what we tend to see is that when you're exercising, the blood flow is diverted away from the central circulation around your organs. So digestion is compromised during that time. So you're basically left in a situation where you can't be taking on that much fuel during those activities. Your digestion is going to be compromised, and you've only got a small period during the day to consume all of that energy, which is clearly a very big ask. And as you go beyond that, then it's very clear why that limit would exist. Because like if you do get up to 5 times BMR, that's 10,000 calories, but now you're squeezing it into a shorter and shorter window, because now you're exercising 8 hours per day or 10 hours per day. So this is why that there is that limit eventually, because there does come a point eventually where like it's 10 times BMR, let's say. Now you're burning 20,000 calories, but you're also exercising 100% of the time. And your digestive system just can't keep up with that when energy or blood flow needs to be diverted to the peripheral skeletal muscles. So hopefully that makes a bit of sense as to why that limit might exist.
100%. And again, it's so important to understand, because I know in people's heads, what they're looking at this now, they're going, oh, well, I follow this bodybuilder or I follow this individual and like they're able to do this and they say they eat this. Well, first of all, most people are liars. That's just the plain and simple of it, right? Especially if they're selling a service, they're going to tell you like, oh, well, I eat 20 million fucking calories per day, and I'm able to get these fantastic results, and like I get all my clients to be able to do this. It's like, okay, you're willfully lying to people purely because you want their money. I'm like, okay, cool. As long as we're all clear on that, that's the case. But also, and especially in the case of bodybuilders, they're on drugs, right? Well, I should say athletes in general, right? They're on drugs. There's no two ways about it. Like your favorite athlete, they're on drugs. I'm sorry to have to destroy your, childhood or whatever. They're all on drugs, every single one of them. When I've talked to any athletes, and I've talked to, world-class athletes, they're all on drugs, all of them. You know, they'll tell you they're on drugs, right? And well, they might not tell you, depending if they like you or not, right? But they're all on drugs. And this is really important to understand because obviously that changes the equation. Like Gary said earlier on, like if we're talking about a fat loss context, and you don't have to worry about reproductive function because you've basically already shut that down because you're on testosterone. And as a result, you've already supplemented that away. No factor, you know, it doesn't matter anymore, right? And it's the same with like, you know, you could be taking like a thyroid hormone, right? Obviously, again, like you don't have to worry about your thyroid, the changes with that. It also probably, again, it does increase your metabolic rate. So now you obviously have like if you increase your metabolic rate by even like, we'll say 250 calories per day, it's like when we multiply that by 2.2, it's like, oh, we actually get more, you know, it's like, it's a fundamental thing. It's like you multiply a number and the number is bigger, you have more, you know, like, so that kind of stuff. It's like, it is important to understand. And like, you might be thinking, oh, well, I never use drugs. I don't want to use drugs. And like, that's not what I want to do. That's cool. But most people out there are using stimulants. And that is also getting around this to some extent, you know, like taking a stimulant, like even caffeine. And like, obviously the health and fitness industry is obsessed with caffeine. Like they chug about fucking 500 milligrams before breakfast every single day. You know, it's like all of that stuff is impacting on your basal metabolic rate, but also, you know, reducing the effects of some of these things. The caffeine is like a dieter's friend because it reduces the drop off you might see in like, oh, I feel less active or I feel whatever. Like you have your afternoon coffee and all of a sudden you're fucking chirpy again. You're like, all right, I'm going to go burn off more calories, blah, blah, blah. So it's like that kind of stuff is important to know. But obviously, look, there's a limit to that stuff, right? Because you're not able to sustain that forever, or you start getting less effect from that, right? Because I hate to use this term because everyone fucking uses it, but like you've basically burned out your adrenals. Not that they can technically be burned out, but you know what I mean? It's like you're getting less of a response from this. You know, you're getting less of a effectively a stress response from this because it is habitual. So as a result, you're like, oh, I need to up my dose, and then you're on fucking a gram of caffeine per day, and that's just caffeine. Like obviously, there's much more powerful stimulants which we've talked about before, but obviously, you know, like that's not necessarily the case for, you know, or we wouldn't recommend that for everyone. But like there are people out there that are using like, you know, Clen, again, thyroid even to an extent, like they're using different drugs to get an effect, to overcome the natural adaptations that your body goes through, right? And obviously that has an effect on BMR, and as a result, it has an effect on this kind of constrained energy model, right? And then the final thing to realize with a lot of these athletes is that they're just bigger than you because they're on these drugs or just because they have better genetics. Like if you're a 100-kilo athlete versus 70-kilo athlete, it's like the 100-kilo athlete is going to be able to burn through more calories just by virtue of weighing more, right? So that has to be taken into account, and most times it's not, especially when we consider like most people we're talking to, they're not athletes, they're just recreational exercisers. So they think, oh, this person is 70 kilos, I'm 70 kilos, and they don't factor in the fact that this person is 70 kilos at 6% body fat and you're 70 kilos at 20% body fat. So as we've discussed previously, lean mass is one of the bigger predictors of that overall metabolic rate rather than fat mass because it's less metabolically active tissue, right? So do you have anything else to say on, we'll call this the G-flux and constrained energy model interaction? Like, how can people use this? What's your final kind of wrap-up thoughts?
I suppose my final wrap-up thoughts would be that exercising more, almost always a good idea. I don't think most people listening to this have to worry about diminishing returns from exercising more. Like I don't think that's much of a problem for many people, but it's more so for those people who are setting their step goal for like 40,000 steps per day and stuff, you know, like those types of things. Like there comes a point where it's probably not going to benefit you too much more, especially like if you're running like hours per day just to burn calories. Like again, probably not the wisest idea. There will come a point where your energy expenditure in other areas will begin to compensate to some degree. Again, that's going to vary so much between people. With a lot of this stuff, we're kind of at the edge of like what's really known. Like for example, it's not clear, like for an ultra endurance athlete, like can you actually put your kidneys under too much work from processing all this energy? You don't really know, because like this is so rare that people burn this much energy. So you don't know what the limit of like, all right, kidney processing and liver processing. Like which is the organ that's going to kind of give first? And that's there. When you read the research, there are some of the things that authors will say. They're like, we're not really sure. That's why that paper on the gut 2 years ago or last year was so interesting, because these things are really difficult to study because they're extreme examples. But most people aren't in that extreme camp. Most people are in a camp where they work a job, let's say 9 to 5 or similar. So they're probably not very active during that time. And they're trying to either lose fat, stay lean, maintain a healthy physique, whatever. They're trying to do that within the constraints of exercising maybe 1 to 2 times per day. With those constraints in place, I don't think people have to worry too much about not benefiting from exercising more. I think you absolutely will, particularly if you're building a program that's aimed at better performance. Even if it doesn't lead to a perfectly linear increase in energy expenditure, I wouldn't say that matters all that much, because ultimately most of our recommendations with regards to exercise generally tend to be for aims other than just burning more calories anyway. So it's sort of redundant. But in general, what I would say is that when you think about calories in, calories out, and all the things we've discussed in the podcast leading up to this, we're adding on that additional layer now of the calorie deficit component, but also the calorie deficit put in the context of energy flux. And generally, if you can get up to a higher energy flux, that seems to be superior, particularly for weight loss maintenance, but also very obviously for any increases in fitness or health benefits that come from exercising more in the first place.
And also just purely the psychological stuff. Like, I like food, you like food, most
Oh
people
man,
like food,
absolutely, yeah.
So
I
I'm
actually feel really bad for people who have to diet on like 1,200 calories and stay there consistently. Like, to be fair, I have clients who, like, they just have really low maintenance calories, and like, let's say it's less than 1,500. And the thing is, when your appetite, their appetite and their energy levels and enthusiasm and motivation, etc., it all correlates perfectly with that level. So from the physiological perspective, it's not really a problem. Like, it doesn't matter if your calories are lower, if you're just not dealing with those things. But you can't really escape the psychosocial aspects of that, unfortunately, particularly in the modern environment, where if you go out to eat, if you're getting something for less than 1,000 calories, like, you're almost having to be specific about asking for it. And that's just the reality, and even with like Irish cooking, let's say, like, Irish mammies are notorious for massive portions, and standard Irish meals are, we eat a lot of red meat, lots of potatoes, just generally like milk or cream or butter maybe in the potatoes. So those, like, even the way that our meals are set up culturally, typically relatively calorie dense too, and I'm absolutely here for it. But sincere apologies to my friends on 1,000 calories a day.
Yeah, like, just from a personal anecdote, I'm like, look, I used to be able to, as I said, eat 5,000 calories and maintain my weight, right? And again, I'm roughly 100 kilos, as Gary said earlier on, So I'm like, that for me, I was like, look, I could literally do whatever the fuck I wanted. Now, sometimes, again, with work, with whatever, it is tough to get that many calories into you. And you do notice some like digestive issues, not necessarily like major issues, but maybe sometimes, like, I don't know, you look in the toilet, you're like, oh, there's some undigested food, it's like, that's interesting, right? And especially if you're trying to, like, cram a load of calories in a short period of time, right? But since I'm way less active now, especially because jiu-jitsu is only on and off because we're allowed to do it outdoors, like, my maintenance calories right now is like, it hovers between 2,500 and 2,750, like somewhere in that range, depending on how active I am throughout the day. Because, as I said, like, I'm sitting at this desk for like 80 hours a week, so my activity levels are so much lower. And just from that perspective of, like, there's basically a 2,500 calorie difference between those. Like, first of all, like Harry said, like, my enthusiasm for food or whatever, it is changed, because I'm like, look, I eat 2,500 calories and I'm like, yeah, I'm quite full. Like, I'm good to go on that. Like, I don't want more, like, well, like, I psychologically, I'm like, look, I'd fucking love more, I'd always want to be like, oh, I want to have, this tasty food or whatever. Like, that's universal, right? But I'm quite satisfied on 2,500, so I'm like, there's no need, like, I don't feel like I need to have more or missing out. However, like, trying to, as Gary said, like, go out for a meal or whatever, like, you have to overcome all those issues. And as I was saying earlier on, like, when we deal with clients that are like that have come from like a a fitness background, a sporting background, like they have a hard time. Like that's why most of them come to us in terms of they're trying to realign their intake with their current activity levels, and it's just hard. And that is an unfortunate consequence, especially if you haven't built up good eating habits in the past, and you just are coming to this going like, I used to be able to get away with 5,000 calories. Now I'm able to get away with 2,000 calories. What the fuck do I do? Because I used to be able to eat crap all day. I have no good health habits. I have no good nutrition habits. I have no good, like, whatever. Where are you at then? You know, so again, we're big advocates of, yes, exercise as much as you possibly can for your situation, within enjoyment levels, within lifestyle levels, whatever, within recovery levels, obviously, as well. But you need to eat, first of all, to sustain that. But most importantly, you need to develop healthy eating habits overall, regardless of your calorie level. Like, you need to know what lean proteins are. You need to know what fruit and veg are good for you. You know, it's like, you need to know this stuff. You need to know how to structure your day if you actually want to get good results. And that's independent of what calories you're on. Anyway, I have nothing else to add. Do you, Gary?
No, I think that's everything for today.
Fantastic. Where can people find us, and what do we do?
Yeah, most important thing, guys. Today is Sunday, the 23rd of May. You're listening to this on the 24th of May. The gym's open in Ireland on the 7th of June, I believe. So we're roughly 2 weeks away from gyms reopening. If you are interested in coaching, then I would recommend you get in touch now so that we can book in a call with you to discuss that process. Make sure you're a good fit for us and we're a good fit for you, and that we can help you as the gyms reopen. Okay, so if you do want to secure space, do get in touch. We will be closing our coaching spaces shortly after the reopening of the gyms. So it's in your interest and ours to try to get involved ASAP. And of course, we would love to work with you, particularly if you're someone who's been listening to the podcast for a while, because we like having interested clients and interesting clients, of course. Along with that, guys, we do put out a lot of content on social media. So it would be wise to follow us all. So Triage Method, we have a page on Instagram. We also have our own pages, Skinny Gaz, The Real Paddy Farrell, and Brian O'Hangisa. So that's the three of us. So follow us all. It would be of benefit to you. We'd also recommend subscribing to the Triage Method newsletter. I will admit I have been slacking on the newsletter over the last 2 weeks, but I will absolutely have a great newsletter for you guys this week. So if you haven't subscribed, please do, because otherwise you will be missing out. There's extra content that goes into the newsletter that doesn't go anywhere else. It doesn't go on our social media. It doesn't go in our Facebook groups. It's just for the newsletter. So it's useful to get involved there. You could do it. We do also have a Facebook group, the Triage Method community, that you can join, ask questions. If you want to send in your training clips for us to have a look at or something, we're cool with that. No problem. And if you'd like to get in touch with us to ask questions for the podcast, there's a form below that you can submit. You can also just email us or drop any of us a DM. It's no problem. And yeah, we're always welcome to people sharing this around on social media. If you enjoy the podcast, give it a share on your story or whatever platform you use. And if the podcast platform you use happens to have ratings and reviews, go ahead and leave one. And of course, subscribe.
Fantastic. Anyway, we will see you all next week, guys. Peace out.